Welcome to yet another Saturday session of Talking Films Online. This is the first session in our River-Centric Art Film Festival. This group, Talking Films Online, was formed on June 2nd, 2020, during the lockdown when most of us were watching a lot more films than we normally do. Almost on a whim, Nikhila and I decided to formalize our Facebook discussions on films by forming an online film club. Since then, we have had uninterrupted discussions on films from all over the world every Saturday at 9 p.m. We have also held film festivals of Iranian, French, East European, Kannada, and other cinemas. We hold an annual smartphone filmmaking contest for students every June as part of our anniversary celebrations. Today, as I just mentioned, is the first session of our River-Centric Art Film Festival, curated by Indra Sankar Ghatak, who will also initiate the discussion on all Saturdays of September. Indro is a research scholar at the School of Humanities and Social Sciences, IIT Mandi. His research interests include comparative literature, Indian literature, partition studies, cultural and translation studies. He has completed BA from St. Xavier's College, Kolkata, and MA in English from Banaras Hindu University. He also holds a UG diploma in Spanish from BHU. He has participated and presented in several national and international conferences, such as those organized by IASA New Delhi and Center for Memory Studies, IIT Madras. He has also published in Scopus indexed Roopkatha Journal on Interdisciplinary Studies in Humanities. He is a sports enthusiast, a singer, and a published poet. He has worked as a coordinator at the BV News, an NGO based in Kolkata. He has been a teaching assistant at IIT Kharagpur and IIT Mandi. Welcome, Indro, and over to you.
Thank you, ma'am. I welcome everyone. Good evening to all of you. So today we start this 1 month long art film festival discussion and talks, and I'll be opening up different avenues of the 4 films that I'll be talking especially. I really thank the organizers of Talking Films Online for hosting me, and I'll try to do justice to the topics that I intend to deliver. So my talk is actually titled Narratives from River-Centric Art Films, an ideational interchange, which is between memory and cultural identities. The Art Film Festival tries to focus on a few art films, namely Sagaroloi Bohudur, which was filmed in 1995, which is an Assamese film, Bishorjon, 2017, Padma Nadir Majhi, 1993, and Titash Nodina, 1973. These films recount how subaltern people are inadequately represented in mainstream cinema. This, my month-long talk, argues also that would try to engage in the debate that the popular film industry does not include these artworks that I would go on to discuss, showcasing the dehumanized communities of boatmen, ferrymen, fishermen, laborers, etc. These are dumped into the category of art films and are barred from the popular motion pictures that aggregate into the grand narratives of history writing. In the aforementioned films, the river acts as an agent of encoding and erasure, displacing the actual selves of the main characters, who all loses his identity and livelihood as a boatman. Once a bridge is built in the village, the first film, Second film, we see Nasir's act of immersing idols of Ma Durga in the border waters invariably makes him an expatriate in a land which is actually Bangladesh in the film, of his origin, and in a land of his religion, which is the state religion of Bangladesh, which is Islam, and also a language, which is Bangla, but he speaks a different dialect. So these nuances also brings us to the other films, that is Ube from Padma Nadir Majhi, who decides to enhance his boatman status from his village and family and escape to the utopian Moyna. And lastly, the last film, Itashikti Nobina, also examines ostracized Malo community who are excommunicated from life at the center and are dispossessed of their lands when the pangs of river Itash consume parts of their villages. So this art film festival shows us how art films are kind of guardians of memory and try to replant or naturalize these evicted people amidst the dwindling light of mainstream memory. Hence, in a digital age such as this, it becomes apparent to carve out spaces for these narratives and genres, which are presented only as figments of memory for capitalists and bourgeois consumers of cinema. Therefore, through these films, memories resurface to position such narratives in the variegated representations of popular culture. It is important to narrate these tales of exclusion, to bring into focus the fault lines of historiography of filmmaking. So I'll be starting off with an exercise for our viewers. Like, please identify the keywords from this discussion, at least five if possible. And we can have it in the chat box being typed out at the end of the session. And we'll come back to this because this will be carried forward for the subsequent discussions. So I'll be starting off with a generalized talk on what my argument or what I posit in my discussion in this art film festival. So film is frequently cited as the most inclusive and synthesizing of performance mediums. According to Stam and Klein, a composite language by virtue of its diverse methods of expression, sequential photography, music, phonetic sound, and noise. The cinema inherits all the art forms associated with these matters of expression. The visuals of photography and painting, the movement of dance, the decor of architecture, and the performance of theater. This is what he claims to be a full-fledged film. This art film festival focuses on the four films that I have already mentioned, which tell us an interesting tale of how boatmen, ferrymen, fishermen, that is the subaltern people living in the margins, away from the humdrum mainstream society or the city, do not find a full-grown representation and also a production house in the mainstream cinema or media platforms to assert their unique selves. These award-winning art films narrate marginal spaces of lived experiences whereby people are relegated to the fringes and their sense of life never becomes part of a larger historiography. Yeah. So the film portrayed one single thread of argument that the mainstream media does not include these art films showcasing the dehumanized communities. These art films are inherently down into the category of the so-called art films and are excluded from popular cinema and hence away from the grand narratives of history writing. The narrative in this context is a tale that serves to justify social norms, power, and authority. A grand narrative, also known as the meta-narrative, is a story that tries to connect disparate historical occurrences and phenomena by drawing on some sort of universal truth or schema. It makes claims about how various historical events can be explained. As opposed to the totalitarianism of grand narratives, Lyotard professes a preference for a plurality of conflicting small narratives in his 1979 book, The Postmodern Condition, A Report on Knowledge. These art films thus serve as the keepers of memory, reminding the bourgeois viewers of visual media that there are stories of the socially, politically, culturally, and economically depicted people whose voices are silent, but the genre of art films replants them amid the fading light of mainstream memory. I'll be drawing on two theorists for this discussion, and it will continue for the rest of the sessions as well. So, in the third decade of the 20th century, sociologist Morris Hallwalks and art historian Amy Warback independently developed two theories of collective or social memory. They unite in a categorical rejection of the notion that collective memory can be explained only biologically as an inherited or a kind of racial memory. Although this is exactly what Carl Jung had described in his theory of archetypes. As opposed to this view of Carl Jung, Warback and Hallwalks shift the discussion of collective knowledge from biological framework to a culture-specific viewpoint. When a person belongs to a specific society and culture, it is thought that socialization and customs, rather than it is thought that a specific society and culture develops its socialization and customs through a phylogenetic evolution, and this is what sustains a person's distinctive character over generation. So these art films thus offer a glimpse into the conception, interpretation, and dissemination of knowledge about the underprivileged. The knowledge that has been passed down through memory has two components that make it binary. The normative component, which provides rules for behavior, and the formative component, which acts as an enlightening, civilizing, and humanizing force. The films covered in this talk acknowledge the latter, which is the formative component, and when they come together to create a brief stories that make up this term called film historiography. So the first film for today's discussion that we have unanimously decided upon is Padma Nadir Majhi, and definitely it is also an adaptation, especially from the famous novel of Manik Bhatnagar, which is also being the same. So how does film actually is how does a narrative, how does a novel especially gets adapted into the film, and what are the dynamics, and how does it fit into the argument of culture and identity studies? So, in through this lens of memory, we try to delve into how an adaptation of a work as well tries actually to supplant this theme of memory, and how art films are actually doing that. So, in the view of the film's theoretician, Christian Metz, cinema tells us stories. It says things that can be conveyed in language as well as words, yet it says them differently. There is a reason for the possibility as well as for the necessity of adaptations. This desire for persistence in a post romantic or a capitalist world such as ours that prioritizes novelty and defies logic. Uh, John Ellis critiqued their opines, and I quote, the process of adaptation should be seen as a massive investment, both in terms of financial and also psychic. The financial for the very cause that films obviously have their budget and they have their production houses, and psychic because it forms a part of the larger film historiography. And this kind of investment is a kind of desire to repeat particular acts of consumption within the form of representation. And this representation can be in various forms, kind of theater, drama, short films, mobile films, pictures. But in this our case, this film that discourages such repetition of what we always prioritize in this capitalist world. And hence, we always try to marginalize these narratives of the art films that the art films talks about. First of all, it marginalizes what the art films talks about. That is obviously the boatman and ferryman. This film obviously is the Machis, the Jades, who are boatmen and fishermen, written and translated from Bengali. And this is how the dynamics into the memory studies obviously uh, probes into. So I again, for this kind of discussion, I also linked back on the adaptation studies, the theory of adaptation of Linda Hashim, who opines that for us in the audience as well, the part of the very real pleasure of watching adaptations lies in recognition and remembrance. So, the art film that I am going to discuss today, they enunciate how the ambit of civilization does not include the low caste or low class community residing unstably on the riverine land of River Podda. And this talks about how a cultural memory, a body of information which is derived, is kind of unique and it has a definite unity and coherence, which needs to be talked about more often than not. This is especially true for Padma Nadir Majhi, and we see where the boatman community, which resides with their own traditional rented boats, small boats, makes oars for who depend on the fishing community and go villages for their labor and just has only subsistence agriculture for their livelihood. So this is how this film tries to kind of paint the picture, the picture of how a community which is segregated from the mainstream life is surviving deftly and very well rehearsed in their practices and kind of engages in labor. So what are the dynamics that goes in between? What comes through us? How is a community consciousness formed? How is adaptation done, which is what I have talked about through some of the theories that I have incorporated in this paper. But how does it actually portray a kind of a uniqueness that I am talking about? Why do we need this? It does so obviously through the simple scenes that we have obviously all most of us or all of us have seen or gone through the film, and we have experienced how culture, which is one of the important markers of any community, is also presented through the kind of folk tales and the folklores that are presented, also through the songs that the female and the male characters or the machis keep on singing. So this is the kind of through this culture we get something of a wisdom which is wrapped in the form of folklore, and this kind of points to the fact that memories are brought to the surface uh, through these films, and so that these narratives can be positioned among the abundance of the popular culture. So when studying through the lens of memory studies, the horizon of cultural memory is unchanging over time and is fixed. So these fixed points are important historical occurrences that have changed the course of history. They are remembered through institutional communication, which can be in the form of recitation, practice, observance, and it can be in the form of cultural formation, which is texts, the rites that we perform, the monuments that we have. So these exclusive institutional communication and cultural formation are referred to as figures of memory by Warburg. So festivals, rituals, epics, poetry, pictures, and other forms of communication produce this term, which Warburg again claims to be islands of time. So what are these islands? Islands are completely a kind of temporality suspended in time. Such moments that is captured in this what I call islands, what actually Warburg called islands, is something which gives us a kind of retrospective contemplativeness into the spaces of the culture, the memory that we try to portray. Yeah, so these are the copies of the books that I've got. This is the middle one is obviously the translated work, which is done by Gautam Ghosh. There are other translations of this book as well, which are out of circulation, but this is the one which has been translated. So delving into the discussion of the film, so it is very important how the different sequences are dealt with. So one of the sequences that I would be talking about is especially a feminist reading of Padma Nadir Majhi. And I would definitely want all of you to join into this discussion and talk about uh, how would you would agree or argue for a kind of feminist reading of this film. So, what are the instances maybe that has gone into drawing of a different kind of feminine picture that you may have in general, or what it is that feels unique to this community of Ketupur, Bangladesh, which is on the banks of River Podda, and how does it affect the memory that I'm poking or probing into repeatedly? So, from the point of view of the director Gautam Ghosh, I feel that he uses the river Podna as a kind of symbol, which shows us that no memory is capable of preserving the past, but only of constructing or restructuring. So this art film that is today's Gautam Majhi analyze the river's ability to kill, and obviously we see there are different senses of killing that is presented through the memories uh, of the characters in the film. An example could be of Rashu, who talks about how his family, his wife and children drowned when he went to Moinadi, and it is such a difficult terrain. We also have instances of the storm in the film where Azan Mia's boat is drowned, and there are various families who lose their near and dear ones. So this is how it actually shows the river's ability to kill. We again come to the river's ability to kill in the later films as well, but it is also the people's ability to talk. Talk is also what is important. So what I mean by people's ability to talk is how narratives of man-women relationship, especially man-woman in this context, because we get to see man-woman binary relationships only in this film. So how it affects that, how the film's narrative or the plot affects the labor kind of livelihood of the individual that we see here. How is it different from mainstream society? How does the author, especially Manik Bandyopadhyay or and in turn Gautam Ghosh, the director of the film, how do they try to portray this community, and what are the unique instances that is etched in our memories? So these are the exact points that I intend to open up for discussion. And I relate to this storm incident. One day a storm rises in the Podda River and leaves a trail of destruction. Kuber tells his wife Mala, "Podda আমাকে যত দেয়, আবার ততই লয়." It is true that Podda gives us a lot, but in return, it takes us a lot from us as well. So the storm wreaks havoc in the village, and Hussein Mia, who is obviously the affluent class, affluent doesn't belong to the affluent class, but obviously is a Nouvelish character, has a messiah complex kind of thing, who offers to lend the helping hand to the villagers, and he takes their humble impression, and it actually corroborates to the moving plot line that we have, and Moinadi comes up and his intended utopian land. So he does so, but in return takes their thumb impressions as proof of this help, so that he can use it later to exploit. So this is how I intend to open up the discussion. Also, I need to clarify what one more aspect of what I feel that the film tries to talk about is something that is intrinsic to this discussion on subaltern theory as well. So how 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 can these boatmen or fishermen who live on very little in their lives, they live on rented boats. Their sustenance is based on that. How is their female figures different from the female figures that we have seen in other films, other boat related films, other films where subaltern historiography is also dealt with. So how is it different? This is one area of mm, one area that needs to be figured out. Another area is how does Kuber, the protagonist of this film, actually form or a kind of I would actually pose this question whether he forms his identity as a boatman, whether he carries over this identity or he tries to ameliorate his Machi or jailer status and in order to escape to the utopian landscape of Moinadi Agni. And this genre of films actually brings up this point of interpretation, a kind of reinterpretation and recreation of how this adaptation process takes place of main grand narrative and how this grand narrative actually also has fault lines amidst them, and we need to probe into those areas so that we get fruitful discussions on how the subaltern historiography through these films is actually constructed. So I leave the session for discussion, and I will be obviously commenting on the takes that I have. So I would like to, I would have loved to play the video of on video, but obviously it's definitely not in the purview of talking films on. So I would be skipping that video and I'll be going into the discussion. So the first discussion is related to the feminist reading of Padma Nadir Majhi or the Boatman of Padma. Yes, ma'am. Do you have any
Oh, have you
responses?
finished or? Oh, okay. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. We can.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Indro, for your, for the many pointers and especially the pertinent questions that you raise about the art film, popular film dichotomy, and as well as the issue of adaptation, both of which would be very relevant in a discussion of Padma Nadir Majhi. So it is now open for discussion. Anyone would like to make a comment or raise a question, please, you may do so now. The film viewing experience, I must say, Indro, was something that was absolutely fantastic. It's a beautiful film, and I think Gautam Ghosh, if I'm not mistaken, is the cinematographer himself. And
Right.
it's just spectacular, the use of color and the shots of the river as well as the village, and and the kind of acting, the method acting, because it really suits the neorealist aesthetic of the film so perfectly. I mean, one would just mistake them for fishermen, not for, actors doing the role of fishermen. So it was, like as perfect as that. So as far as the viewing experience goes, it's just something really fantastic. And there is an Indo-Pak adaptation of this novel as well. It's called Jago Hua Savera, and that's made in Hindi. And that is also that film is available on YouTube, and that's also a very nice adaptation of this particular novel. Yes, anyone would? Nikhila, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, just to get the discussion going and
Yeah.
to thank Indro for opening out the discussion with some very interesting questions about this art film. I mean, even in discussions of parallel cinema, Gautam Ghosh and particularly this film rarely figures. So thanks, Indro, for asking us to watch this film. With regard to the adaptation question, I haven't read the novel, so I can't say much about that. But two kinds of points that occurred to me while watching the film. Of course, I must say that, like Geeta, visually it was spectacular, Indo, but I had great difficulty following the film for a very long time because I think I was relying on the subtitles, and the subtitles really do disservice to the film. I don't know if it is because of the subtitles or really, your unfamiliarity with the milieu. I found it really difficult for quite some time to follow what was happening on the screen. Nevertheless, either because of this, not being able to follow much, or I don't know if this Hussein character is meant to be like that. I found him extraordinarily interesting. I mean, I thought that the film is, either telling us that he's this, visionary who is taking these villagers, taking these fishermen out from the kind of doomed lives that they live, providing them hope on the one hand, but at the same time, he also seems diabolic, So is he taking them to a morally, what shall we say? A zone where these social norms, which also explains how Kuber and Kapila, finally make their way towards Moinadi Dweep in the end. So I found him extraordinarily interesting. Can't put my finger on is he diabolic? Is he a visionary? Is this whole project a kind of an utopia from the lives that they are leading, or is it a way of exploitation? So I found it, hard to interpret, and also I thought if it's ambiguous, and if that's how the novel also wants us to read Hussein, then it's wonderful. That is one aspect. The second aspect, which is on the screen too, this feminist reading that you are kind of asking us to offer to, the narrative. It's a film, where there is a certain sense of assertive and also playful erotic sexuality of Kapila, but there's also this sense of, I was also kind of, while watching the film, I was thinking of the contrast between the wife who is for the most part bound, homebound, housebound, not just because of her condition, but because that's what is expected of the wife. Whereas Kapila is the one who we find moving between different spaces. So she's married and gone home, gone to her marital family, but she returns to the natal family. From the natal family, she moves to the Majhi's, her sister's house. Again, she's the one who's traveling when the daughter is ill. So it's like there is a contrast between these two different women, and of course, in the end, she's the one who actually gets to go to Moinadi Dweep as well. So I thought it's quite interesting the way it sets up a contrast between the two women, the stay-at-home, Mala, I don't know if I got the name right, and the one who is on the move, Kapila. who's going everywhere. So anyway, wonderful film, and thanks for for your very competently done introduction, Indra. Thank you.
The wife also gets a chance to go once, and she actually says that she's so happy that, she has gone. And then the reaction of the husband, it is absolutely predictable, like he's upset about it. And the fact that she has gone with Rashu escorting her. So I think that brings out the contrast even more, between Kopila and this woman. Yeah, Indro, would you like to say something? Or,
Yeah, I would actually like to comment on this, especially feminist reading of what the Padma Nadir Majhi may imply, or maybe giving us more avenues to think. One very interesting fact is that the old woman in the very beginning of the film, opening sequence, calls that it's a boy, that is a male. So how the birth of a male child is shown to be something which has to be talked about. And in the same instance, when Kuber comes back to his village for the first time, a villager who actually tells him that he has that a male boy is born in his house. So and it is fair complexion, which is against the contrast of Kuber. So there is this question of how is the boy fair skinned when Kuber is dark, or like the fellow boatman, like who's Gonsha, or Kuber's friend, he replies that Kuber's wife is fair. So, but still, the villager insists upon you don't stay at home in the nights and nothing can be said. So it actually points out to some certain ways of how women have been or were being looked at in that society as well, which is not very different from the one we have actually read in our novels or in history books as well. Moreover, another point of that comes to us is Gopi's marriage. Gopi's the daughter of Kuber. She is actually firstly she's given to Zubillah. She's kept for her, to be used in the words like kept for her. But Ganesha's wife, that is Lupi, yeah, she actually rejects that relationship because Gopi becomes lame after the storm incident. But in contrastively, we see how Rashi finds for a new wife back home when he comes to Ketipur from Moinadi. He finds for Gopi, gives him this chain, and Gopi accepts it. And for the most part of the film, we are quite assured that Rashu would actually win over, to use this word, win over this female character of Gopi. But things turn different. Another important way is that how Rashu would like to give dowry, that is money and jewelry, as a kind of exchange for Gopi. So this is also a kind of anti-dowry stance that we see. One very important, obviously, factor that obviously Gita ma'am and Nikhila ma'am pointed out is towards his contrasted feminine characters was pitted against each other, and they are shown to be as if in a very combative, competitive, binary kind of framework that we actually despise. We actually don't want. But they are shown very differently. One is very lively, another one is a lame character, always at home. When Kopila goes out with Kuber, she is obviously rendered with much love, and whereas he chides excessively every time to Mala. And also the instance of when Mala goes out once in her in so many years, as she rightly points out, that is also for the cause or the sake of her daughter, and also for seeing a doctor. She is obviously beaten, and we see the sequence of how there is a mental and physical abuse. And to make up the situation at night, the situation scene changes to something of eroticism when Kuber actually makes up for his uh, bad behavior by making love to her at night. So these are the contrasts. Another very important observation from that or takeaway from this film is how women folk are actually seen. I would actually talk that adaptation of the women characters has been very truthful to the novel. So I will be referring back to the novel of how Manik Bandyopadhyay actually, from a high caste position that he himself belongs to, is actually looking upon women, and he sees these women folk to be in the domestic spheres of their household, but we do not see them venturing out for like labor or fishing or mending the boats maybe or mending the houses when the storm rages. But they are always in the domestic sphere. They're always coy, flirtatious, coquettish. There is a kind of eroticism. There is a kind of male gaze that always goes around in these films. This particular film, and it is actually I'll contrast this idea. I'll bring this up next week as well. How Pita Shetty Modirna actually differently portrays the female characters. So these are the very important pointers to which I feel that come up again and again, and it is very and pointing out to the end of the film. We will have a section on the end of the film as well, like one. If we take, for instance, the case of Moinabid incident where Inayat and Wasim's wife, that is there, who actually there is this Inayat who is punished for being for entering into Wasim's uh, household, and they are seen together, and Inayat claims that she looks at me all the time and smiles, and he's being punished for 2 days for with no water, no food, and Hasim holds his wife by the hair, and he calls out, "You foolish, lousy woman, you shameless woman, I'll cut you in pieces." So these are some things which actually probes deeper. But again, when Hossein Mia comes to the Hossein Mia is kind of um, like a figure who is very different. And in his island, in his Moinadi, he talks about how Inayat and Hasim's wife, they have fallen in love. He actually sees in the night sequence that goes on in the film. And in the very next morning sequence, we see that Hasim is being sent back to the mainland, and this Inayat and the wife of Hasim are being are seen to be coming together. That is, Hussein Mia says to Hasim that divorce her and forgive the mistake. So although he kind of elevates the status that a woman can have self-expression, self-esteem, and can go on to preserve that, yet he terms this kind of transgression or a kind of infidelity, that is, infidelity is a very strong term. So Hasim himself looks very old for the wife, and it shows how still this incident of this exchange of smiles and coyness with Inayat is seen as a mistake. And coming to the character of Kopila, obviously, she is absolutely seen as a, I would say, as an unnatural character in this naturalness of the portraits that are drawn by the director, novelist, and obviously the filmmakers. So she is actually a kind of anomaly, I would say, because she stands out. She definitely stands out. She leaves her in-laws house. Uh, Her expression is very clear. Her coyness is clear. She is always teasing Ube, and she's not afraid of the consequences of staying with him at night alone when they are with the doctor's hospital. So these instances always points out to the anomaly. I would again use the term that Kokila is in this narrative, which is actually a kind of the rightful way of asserting the feminine hood that we generally we associate nowadays. So that is how stands apart from the rest of the women not being engaged in petty affairs. Obviously, she is shown in that way, but it's more liberating, to be honest, and the way she takes her own decision at the very end of leaving along with Kuber to Moinadeep is also something which talks about her vigor, her confidence, and the self-respect that she possesses within herself. So these are some of the pointers that I would have taken up for the feminist reading. Secondly, I would come to this point of what are the characteristics of film that is developing into the theme of from the point of view of memory studies. Maybe probably film studies scholars would come into the discussion here because I am from a literature background from this, so I have studied only this adaptation theory. So I was looking at from that way how it's adapted and how it contributes to the memory studies. If there are unique distinctions within this study of within the domain of film studies, I would be very happy if anyone can comment and or actually bring to the fore to this discussion.
Would anyone like to speak now? Not necessarily about this particular theme, but anything else that you would like to talk about this film? Sahil, would you like to tell us about some things that you learned while researching Bangladeshi cinema?
Yes, ma'am.
Please go
While
ahead.
I was after watching Padma Nadir Majhi, I went through some Bangladeshi films in which the main character of the Padma Nadir Majhi, who plays the role of Kuber, I went through his films. I went to watch Dukai. It is a film based on natural calamity, but it I think I somehow can relate to Padma Nadir Majhi to the film of Dukhai because the characters, the setting, all always same, and we both the directors had this social realism theme, and and as these are art films, so we get to see the authorship of the directors, where they get involved in the editing and cinematography and all. And in in both these films, there were good focus on thoughts, dreams, and motivation of the characters. And another point I would like to make on Hussein Mia, he seemed to be kind of a secular guy, where he says that as long as people get into Moinadeep, be it of any other religion, he just wants the people to get into the Moinadeep and to populate it.
Yes.
Thank you, Sahil.
Exactly.
Yeah, thank you. Anyone else? Yes, Ajanta, please
Yes,
go.
yes. Good evening. So first of all, I wanted to congratulate the young scholar. It's such a towering piece of cinema, and seeing it again after a very, very long time. So thank you very much. So I don't know very much about memory studies, but I just wanted to make a point about the reference you made at the beginning, yeah, about Carl Jung and cultural memory. So intro, I want to say that, Carl Jung has also a very, very complex notion of archetypes, which are not completely biological. Huh? So I have some acquaintance with the tradition of psychoanalysis and how that looks at memory. So you might, there are two or three names that I thought you might find relevant. Yeah, one is this a psychoanalyst called Stephen Bolas. Well, what's his, Christopher Bolas, right? He's the kind of leading analyst today who's also, who I think trained with Jung. So I mean, Jung has been read in very many ways. And another person called Stephen Frosch. So he actually has this idea of haunting, you know. So I wasn't, I'm not familiar with the theorists that you were talking about, but today it's absolutely kind of, you know, evidenced in biology as well, that memories are actually passed on. And a lot of the Holocaust studies, yeah, a lot of psychoanalysts, of course, were Jews. So there is a very, very strong kind of emphasis on precisely what do you recover. There are clearly, in some ways, you know, even the term haunting, yeah. How do past generations haunt us? So as I said, you know, I'm not a memory studies person, but I thought you know, the idea of the river as being completely malleable is exactly what Sigmund Freud would say. Yeah, there are kind of experiences that are passed on, but what we remember is never ever something that was actually there. So I just found the opening comments very evocative. I'm sorry I'm not able to say much about memory studies, but just to point out that Jung has also a very complex notion, and certainly Christopher Bolas and Stephen Frosch are theorists that you might find, you know, as your studies go along, of use. But thank you. You know, it was such a fantastic film. I'm seeing it after a very long time again. Thanks.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am, for the insights into this discussion, which is very, very helpful for me as well to look into some of the theorists that you have talked about. Definitely. Bringing into view, what are some of the characteristics of filmmaking? I'm obviously not a film semiotician myself, but obviously the use of the term social realism and the way Nicola ma'am also talked about how the cameras and the play of colors, and I would bring into notice the play of music as well. So how it affects the rising tensions and the notions that come along with it, and especially the songs, the Bengali songs, the folk songs that are there. So one of my videos, one of the clips that I had was of this song as well, which also shows the circular path of this mundane fisherman community that we are seeing, the boatman community. So how it talks about their ways, but it also creeps back to this idea of inclusivity that one of the scholars also pointed out of not just Hosseiniya, but also of the community at large, how they are together in the three festivals that we see. It is Hosseiniya talking about Rathir Mela, that is the Rath of Jagannath Dev, and also we see Durga Puja, where all are celebrating. We also see the instance of Holi at the end of the film, which is also being celebrated by all the communities, irrespective of their caste, class, religion, creed, and everything. So, and moreover, when the storm rages, we see this unique kind of secular viewpoint of how the conch shells are ringing, and there is this one person who calls out Allah's name, and obviously we also are very much we also look into the characteristics of Hossein, who definitely wants life in his island irrespective of religion. So this is what sustains the idea of Moinuddin, and he has evidently given everything for that in his entire life. And that's where we arrived at the comment on the ending of the film, which is very cryptic, enigmatic, and it shows different lights. It shows actually various ways in which one can interpret the film. So how what does River stand for at this point? What does Hosseiniya stand for? These are the questions that come up time and again. And for me, the river acts as a kind of inclusive kind of subject that incorporates each and every community, each and every religion, each and every section of the people, of our populace that is present in these few villages that are named. One is Ketupur, one is Chatonga, another one is Akuthakur village. So these are the these shows us how it obviously gives, it floods, it gives and always takes away. So there is always this transactional thing that goes on. And another important thing is that Podda is a very large river, and the fishing community obviously forms a very small part of that entire economic transaction that goes on in or around Podda or across its waters. So that's also a very important way of interpreting, and also how Moinadeep becomes this utopian kind of, whether it is a utopia or a dystopia, it's very contested, because from Rashu's words in the very beginning of the film, we come to know that Moinadeep is infested with lions, tigers, crocodiles, and everything. And when we develop this film, the plot develops. We also see Podda having dead fish coming up, or very few fish coming up, and gradually we see how the trade relations have been revived by Hussein Mia and his boatmen, and Kuber also works in one of those boats, and how they are actually transacting, and not just human beings, but also goods and various other commodities, I'm sure. And it points out to this fact whether it is actually a place of refuge, whether it is a detention camp, because if we think of detention camp in this sense, like people who are committing crimes, or maybe they are framed into crimes. So how are they are ending up there, or whether they have lost their livelihood, whether they have lost their family. We also see a family being transported. We also see Aminuddin being transported, who actually ruminates a lot on life at large. He's philosophizing life, unlike Kuber, but yet he finds himself into that island as well. And their point of clearing out jungles, leasing out land, writing pattas, also brings into notice the point of eco-criticism, or how what nature actually holds for memory building, I must say. So the boats, the fisherman community, and obviously the water is actually a kind of metaphor for the fluid or the fluvial passage of memory that happens, not just in terms of men, women, or just from past to present, but also in terms of goods, or this kind of labor livelihood kind of thing. So this is how I think the ending sums up a very poignant note on looking at films from a different, altogether kind of having an open-ended stance, and which is very difficult. Obviously, the discussion came up that whether Hussein Mia is a diabolical figure or he's a kind of messiah. It is very difficult to discern, but whatever we get, because at one point he's taking these people to Moinadeep, he's giving them job, a refuge, he's also getting them back to the mainland. But at the same time, he has taken the thumb impressions. He has given these people loans, or like without them knowing. So what is exactly it comes to us is a difficult stance. And also we need to keep in mind that Mia is not an inmate of the village from the very beginning. In the very one of the sequences, it is talked about that he has come out from somewhere and had settled there, and he was a very poor person who has built his way up to the waters, to the main cities and mainlands, and he has a lot of money. He makes a lot of money. So there are different ways in which one can interpret. So this is
sorry, does he not make his money through the opium trade?
Yes, yes.
So I think there's a very sinister background that's built up. I don't remember. And you're right, to come back to Geeta and Nikhila, may I just come in again? Is that okay?
Absolutely okay, Ajanta. Please go ahead.
Thank you. So, of course, the setting is very different. But what immediately I was reminded of, because, we're reading him now, is, of course, for me, Amitabh Ghosh every time comes up. And there was this, I remember this maybe 2 years ago. So I think it's the University of Oxford, and you will probably be able to get it on their website. So they organized this fantastic conference, called Living Through the Cyclone. And you had people like Amitesh Mukhopadhyay, Anujales, who actually work on these communities, and precisely what does development mean? Because Hussein Mias has a history, and we are, this utopia has an entire dark side, and we don't really know what it is. But I'm not, yeah, to me, it kind of, borders on the fact that these people are trapped in some ways. I don't know. I could be wrong. Yeah.
Thank you,
I
Ajanta.
also think the same. Thank you, ma'am, for this comment. I also think the same that these people are actually trapped in a very unforeseen circumstances, and they are like brought into this foray of uh, taking them through to this journey of crossing the rivers and through the seas. And it is actually one of a very, very ambiguous stance. And we are all left on our own to interpret the various ways of the film or the novel actually points to. Yeah.
Geeta, if I may just comment.
Yeah, please. Please.
Just to ask Indro, is there any particular timeline that this is set in? I mean, from my one viewing of the film, I couldn't really make out if there is some particular time that it is set in. Could you just tell us a little bit about that, Indro?
This book, the book novel was written around 1936 to 41. So probably it reflects on that timeline. And, and the timeline that is there in the film, it is obviously not situated in any context. It is absolutely taken away from this large historiography and the center that we hold, that grand narratives. It's obviously in isolation. That is why I kept up talking about these islands of time and what are these fixed points that we need to unfix and unravel the treasures of memory that we need to look. But roughly, the film goes from the month of Sawan, to the Fagun. So this because of Roth and Durga Puja, and it ends in Holi. So this kind of a period of around 9 months, 8 to 9 months that this film ranges. So this is one thing that I have come up with. But obviously, yeah, there is no mention. So it cannot be situated in any of the time frame, to be very honest. It can be even today. It can even be today because of the way these people live on the bare minimums. And this is even evident. Some of all the pictures that I've shown is all taken by myself, and I have more pictures to share in the upcoming session. So I have been doing this kind of out of my passion on boats and rivers, and moving all over India and even to the islands to see what is exactly going on and what exactly is being archived or it's going on. So what are the angles that is coming? Mostly the debates, as Ajanta ma'am also talked about, is circling around in terms of climate change at the moment, which is very pertinent in this era, and all the narratives that are submerged or suppressed needs to talk about climate change, and it is very important that we don't leave out this intrinsic phenomenon of culture that is very basic tenet of all communities that we come across, and how one culture is different from the other. I would be again talking about Pitashakti Modinam in the next week, and I'll be pointing to the contrasts of how Padma Nadir Majhi is different from Pitashakti Modinam or vice versa, and what are the exact demarcations we talk, because we are talking about similar landscape, that is rivers. We are talking about present-day Bangladesh or undivided Bengal. The writers are from the similar time period, 1940s, 1950s. But the writers belong to different caste class origins. They both have lived and stayed in Kolkata. And these are exactly the points, and obviously the protagonists, the people, that they are boatmen and fishermen. So how and are they going different or contrasting to each other? So this is another area that would be discussed further in the upcoming sessions of this art film festival.
Sorry, Geeta, if I can ask one more question to
Of course,
yeah.
you can, Nikhila.
Again, Indra, just about this time itself, I read somewhere that this is a film that is discussed as a partition film, and yet it did not seem, at least while watching the film, it did not seem to dwell on or foreground some of the issues which we think of as characteristic of a partition film. Is the novel, somewhat more explicit with regard to, religion or the communities, or is this film discussed? Is this novel and this film discussed in the context of partition at all?
I personally do not think this novel and film can actually be partition kind of narrative. But there are links, there are obviously references, particularly in terms of the language that is used. Because the West Bengal dialect and the dialect of East Bengal, there are different dialects. We have multiple dialects of each part. So this is one thing that is actually quite interesting, and the film uses the East Bengali dialect, and this is one area where there are dichotomies. Moreover, on the idea of maybe trade relations, it could come up, but it's not explicitly mentioned. More secularity or secularism is dealt with. Probably it is inherently in those lines, showing a larger, showing a light to the larger audience. And as I had mentioned, that audience obviously needs to be very active in participating and understanding these adaptations or these films, and need to interpret very actively, so that we develop this cultural nexus that we share. Other references to partition, there are not exclusive ones that I recall of at the moment. No, I don't remember any other references.
I was reading somewhere that, sorry, Indra, please go ahead.
Just that, adding on to that, that partition would be coming in another film, that is Bishojom. So obviously that is a very intriguing tale where river comes in, partition comes in, and we obviously think of river as some kind of territory which is not owned by any person or individual or group, but it belongs to all. But it serves also as the border, and how in the short term we will see how this also adds to the dimension of the river-centric art films. Yes, ma'am.
I was reading somewhere that it is set in pre-partition times, and if it's an indication, then I think somewhere Hossein also mentions that he has given a loan of 23 rupees for building the house or something of that kind. And talking about secularism, yes, in terms of Hussein's, he's not discriminating on the grounds of religion to populate his island. But I think if I got it right, there is a mention of when he's, distributing money after the storm to rebuild the houses and all that. If I got it right, correct me if I'm wrong, I think the Brahmin gets 7 rupees and then the rest of them get some 4 or 5 or something less. Somewhere there is some inequality in the, dispersal of funds for rebuilding. So I thought, that the question of the caste dynamics in the village comes up there. And also to go back to a point you raised about Kapila being, unnatural and anomaly in that. I don't know what exactly you meant by unnatural, but I thought hers was one character that was closest to nature. Her expression of sexuality and her sensuality. She, to me, kind of, was the human embodiment of the river, which is, in its own way, a character in the film. So I would think of her as natural in that sense, closest to nature.
Thank you, ma'am, for this very thing. I actually meant unnatural anomaly in terms of the novelist and the director or cinematographer, and how they have portrayed Kopila to be unnatural. I'm not obviously telling that she's unnatural.
Okay.
She's portrayed to be the unnatural amidst all the natural women that we see. So I have used this quotation marks. Yeah. So it's very, very nicely, you have very nicely put forward this the close to the nature and obviously symbolizing or incorporating the river thing that is there. It is obviously it is one thing that is unconventional that I would use for in that period, the period that we are talking about, 1936 to 1941, when this novel was written, pre-partition era. Obviously, it's unconventional. I would say in those terms, but obviously this is the most is the person with the most self-esteem and self-expression and most closest to nature that I would agree with you as well.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments, questions? Anyone else would like to speak? No? Okay.
I would also like to add
Yes.
one more point that was raised we talked about the timeline. We try to fix whether it's in a context, but we see that their lives do not change. Whatever events happen, pre whatever the time frame that is set within the movie, we we learn of Rashu's incident of fleeing to Moinadeep, and we end up with Kuber's incident of going to Moinadeep. So their lives actually do not change, which is also an indication that the movie does not have a clear timeline, which is there. But this is something which needs to be talked about, and especially on the because we don't get something unnatural in that. So that is what universal charm, which is that's actually universal. It can be in any era set that I have always told about. This is one thing that is I feel.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, if there are no more comments, questions, we will bring this to a close. Thank you very much, Indro, for initiating the discussion, for curating this festival, and for initiating the discussion. We are going to be seeing more of you. And thank you all for logging in. Please keep coming for our sessions every Saturday, 9 p.m. Zoom. Good night and have a nice Sunday.
Thank you all. See you next week. Bye. Good night.
Good night. Bye.